Imagine explaining quantum mechanics to a dog. Quantum mechanics is a very well specified theory, but it's just beyond a dog. And like, maybe at some point we're the dogs, like we're not going to understand what's going on. And we build tools. We can already see beyond our eyes with telescopes, and we could add up numbers we can't add, with calculators and computers, and do all these amazing things. So maybe like it's just going to be beyond us, and we'll have to accept it and take different forms of explanation that are much more general. Or maybe we're just going to be in this predictive world and it's not even dystopian, like everything could be better. We'll just have stories about how this stuff works. So like maybe scientists will be like the new priests, just interpreting things and like explaining it to how it works and providing meaning to the systems.
Bradley, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you. So, for people who don't know, you are the professor of cognitive and decision sciences in experimental psychology at UCL. And you are also uh, building one of the main builders of a large language model that is focused on helping people do better neuroscience research called BrainGPT. And I'm super psyched to have you on. This is going to be like a slightly non-traditional episode because I think we're going to go deep into science and using AI for science and sort of like how science might change as a result of AI. But yeah, super psyched to have you.
No, I'm excited too. And like you hint at, I think there's larger ramifications that go beyond neuroscience, where we developed this model for, that should affect all your listeners.
Cool. So like tell us like let's get started with BrainGPT. Like tell us about what it is.
Sure. I mean, first, maybe give some of the motivation. So, unlike probably a lot of your listeners, I was never really a big tool development person, but I just saw how science was going, and it's exponentially increasing, literature literally increasing, and we just can't keep up. It's just not really a human readable literature, and so just kind of getting a grip on it. It seems like we need tools to do that, and people are making all kinds of tools, particularly using large language models, but we kind of had a different take on it. So there's a lot of great work that we call like backward looking, which is not to be pejorative. It's work involving summarization of the scientific literature, kind of writing instant reviews or almost meta-analyses in cases. And that's great and that's valuable. But we want to focus more on like what I think is really important in science, namely prediction. So what we call forward looking, and can we actually predict the outcome of studies before they happen? And so we just really have in this project, and I'm happy to dive in as far as you like, but we wanted to see, can large language models, both just off the shelf models, but also models that we fine tune on 20 years of the neuroscience scientific literature, can they actually predict the results of neuroscience studies, experiments, better than human experts like professors of neuroscience? I mean, in short, there's a lot to say, but in short, they can. They're a lot better.
That's fascinating. Wait, so just to go back to the original motivation, it sounds like the first thing was like, okay, there's like way too much information. There's way too much science being done for anyone to keep up. But it sounds like the thing that you're building, BrainGPT, isn't necessarily about summarizing the research. It's about predicting what future research might hold. So like what's the connection between not being able to keep up with the literature and kind of like future research predictions?
Sure. That's a great question, because I mean, I think to predict the future, you have to have some understanding of the past. So not necessarily like a nice clean text that's summarized, but a model that could draw on thousands of findings through different literatures at different levels, because like neuroscience is multi-level. It has everything from psychology and behavior all the way down to really low level cellular, molecular findings, things involving DNA and so forth. And so, I mean, no one could really draw on all that information, but it might be that biology is really messy. It's not like how computer scientists create these abstraction layers. We have the hardware, the software, and so forth. To make a prediction, you might very well need to draw on all that information. And why do you want to make a prediction? Because, I mean, well, first, there's so many uses in science for this. So you maybe want to run a more informative study. So if BrainGPT predicts that your study is going to work out 99.9% certain as you expect, there's really no information gain in that. There's no reason to run the study. by the other on the other hand, if the system says, oh no, this is unlikely to give the pattern results you expect, but you have an intuition that the literature has gone off course and there's a systematic bias, that same bias is affecting what BrainGPT is trained on, then like in some sense you're like trailblazing, you're making a really impactful discovery. So really everything, getting into reproducibility is a huge, and replication is a huge issue in science. Like most findings just don't actually replicate. And so I think we could in the future, very near future, use systems like this to kind of get a handle on what's true, what we could count on, what next step we should take in scientific discovery. Yeah.
Is it like when you're training it, how are you taking into account the fact that like, p hacking occurs and like maybe the literature is like somewhat damaged? Like if are you training it on literature? How do you filter that out, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, right now, not so much, but that's something that's definitely of interest. So, I mean, the way I see it, I mean, I don't think scientists see it this way. I mean, I'm a scientist, but most of them, most people think of papers as like individual contributions or discoveries, but I think of each contribution as even if it's not p-hacked, as really flawed, noisy, incomplete. But you have this like tapestry of thousands of papers, and so hopefully if you just aggregate, it's almost like in machine learning if you do an ensemble. So it's like an ensemble of everybody hopefully has the signal in the correct direction. I mean, that's why I raised the possibility before that there could be systematic biases or issues, but I think a lot of the problems just really come down to underpowered studies, like statistically. So, and that opens the door to p hacking or just a careless mistake. And so hopefully there's not that many systematic flaws. And if we could just not start reasoning about individual papers, but about thousands of papers at once, I think we'll get the signal.
That's really interesting. And you said it predicts better than like neuroscience experts, like which studies are going to work and which won't. Like, what are the boundaries around those kinds of predictions? Like, what is it good at predicting?
Yeah, yeah. So the way we tested it, I mean, kind of taking our cue from what people do in computer science and machine learning, where they make benchmarks. Like the ImageNet benchmark was really critical to developing computer vision models. So we made our own brain bench model, and what we did is we looked to the Journal of Neuroscience, which is kind of a standard, well-respected journal in neuroscience. And the reason we chose it is because it gets to your question that it really covers all of neuroscience. There's 5 subsections to it. And it goes from everything from cognitive behavior, like pretty high level stuff, to like cellular, molecular systems, to developmental psychiatry type stuff. And so our benchmark would have these 5 subscores. And what we did is we took recent um, publications from this journal that are unlikely to have leaked into the training sets of models. And we trained some models from scratch where we know what they're trained on. But what we did is we just subtly altered these abstracts. So scientific abstract, just to back up for readers that haven't read a scientific paper, they tend to be structured that there's a bit of background at first, a couple sentences, then like the method, what kind of experiment was run, and then the result. And so we just altered the result in very subtle ways, like kept the kind of linguistic flow. So if it was like blah, 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 anterior hippocampus, we changed it to blah, 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 posterior hippocampus. And so basically or something was this brain activity increases, we made it decreases. And so so it was a multiple choice basically with 2 options. And we tested basically neuroscientists and a whole slew of large language models, including some that we fine-tuned on neuroscience literature, and just compared their accuracy.
That's really interesting. And I guess like for you, like what do you think is the current sort of frontier for neuroscience? Like what are the interesting problems right now and how does BrainGPT fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. I mean, in some ways, like neuroscience has been around for a while, but in other ways, it's still like a really young discipline, say compared to physics. And some people could even say it's almost like pre sort of. There's no standard model or anything like
Yeah.
that in physics. So
Pre-paradigm pre-paradigm.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was grasping for. Thank you. So there's still like, I mean, a lot of what I do in research, I do like empirical research modeling, but I feel like a lot of time I'm just trying to figure out like what the question is or how to frame things. But people are. I mean, there's so many questions, and some of them are relevant to. I mean, it goes from really high level stuff to really low level stuff. Like how. I mean, we all think like we have synaptic change, and that's the basis of learning. But even that's up for grabs, and how that works, even at the very low level, like how is a memory encoded and the brain, is it in sort of those synapses, the weights, as we do in neural networks? Is it something more internal to the cell? How does error uh, propagate for learning? So that'd be relevant to like deep learning. Does the brain do gradient descent? Does it do something else? And that's high level stuff like is like when we understand space, is that the basis for higher level mental concepts like freedom, justice, or just chair? Or is it like just a general learning mechanism? So there's all these issues that go from very low level to high level. It's such a huge field. Like I can't really say there's one issue, and I kind of gravitate towards the ones that might have a bleed over or transfer into AI machine learning personally.
And what are the ones that you think are like the most like kind of bleeding over into AI machine learning?
Yeah, well, I mean, one that I don't work on that's seems like an obvious candidate is just like transferring power consumption ideas. So like, I mean, modern GPUs are amazing and they power transformers, which power AI revolution and other technologies. But of course, like, these data centers are going up every day and it's stressing the grid. There's carbon impacts and so forth. Whereas like, our brains are doing a lot of computation, but I guess you just have to, eat a sandwich or something, and it's a lot less power consumption. So that sort of neuromorphic computing applications
I'm just
seem
excited for
relevant.
like a world where like
Yeah,
Microsoft data centers, like they just
yeah,
like order a big load of Subway, and it drops it off.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like a reverse matrix or something. Like you just give it a salad; it doesn't use us as batteries. But yeah, that's really funny. Yeah, but possible. I mean, there's so many things. I mean, I'm really interested in the higher level stuff. So I mean, I still think where people are better is like somehow we have some tricks for how we represent the world and tasks and promote generalization. I mean, in some sense, why we're so excited, everyone's so excited about large language models is that they're like base or foundational in some sense that you could apply them to other tasks, not just the tasks they're trained on. Whereas previous generations of machine learning models, even the great like convolutional models that somewhat cracked object recognition or like AlphaGo, doing you know doing its games and so forth. Like those are specialized models, and I think people are still the kings of that flexibility. So there's probably some secret sauce to gain still from humans and how we represent situations and generalize and link things up.
That's really interesting. Wait, can we see a demo of it? Like, do you have a way to like use Brain GPT that we can look at?
Oh, it's actually so your show. There's a lot of like good guests that do interesting things with prompting. So this is actually a failure of prompting, which might be even more interesting to your guests and give them a new way to interact with large language models. So it's not going to be visually exciting because it's just going to be me talking, but maybe it'll be like informative. So we tried. Doing kind of what you would expect we would do, like firing up GPT-4, which we did back in the day, like the previous version, and saying, give it a few prompts, like, hey, we're going to give you two versions of pretend you're a neuroscientist. We're going to give you two versions of scientific abstract and neuroscience. One of them is true, one of them is altered. Which one is the original? So it was above chance at that, but it's like my memory's bad, but maybe it's like 61%. So that's actually like pretty much human level. But if instead of interacting with the model, you actually just have access to the weights, which you don't for GPT-4, but you do for like the Llama family of models, for a lot of other models, for Mistral free models and so forth, and Falcon models. There's a lot of models out there where there's access to weight, and Microsoft's fee models, a smaller accessible model. With those models, you could actually just compute what language researchers call perplexity, which is how surprising the text is in the model. So it's like given what the model has been trained on. So it's like basically, eating all the scientific literature and that's set all the weights. How aberrant is this text passage? And so if you do that, it has two real advantages. The first one is it's just way more accurate. So it'll have a lower perplexity for the correct version than the incorrect version. But what's also really powerful is that you could take the difference in perplexity, how surprising these two passages are, and you could use that as a measure of confidence in the model. And it turns out that confidence is calibrated to its accuracy. So when the model is more confident, when the difference in the perplexity of the correct and incorrect passage is larger, the model is more likely to be correct. So that's really important for human machine teaming, because you could put a human and a machine together and you could get a better result than either one alone. So we have some analyses like that we're writing up now for a follow-up publication. But basically, it's interesting why the prompting doesn't work. I mean, I think the issue is that usually in multiple choice, the difference between the options is pretty large. Whereas here, it's really subtle. Like that example I gave, interior, posterior, increases, decrease. It's pretty like subtle. And I think scientific literature, again, is noisy and imperfect. And I also think this task is not like a lot of its tuning that it was given to be conversational, like its reinforcement learning through human feedback or other supervised fine tuning. I know these models generalize really well to tasks, but I think this is still like kind of a weird task for them to do, even with a few examples of prompting. So it just turns out you could really, to me, it's like a pattern recognition problem. If you could just like look at all the model's weights and get its perplexity out, they just do much better. As a matter of fact, they're like in the 83% range. So you get like a 20% bump, and like humans are only at 63%. So they get sort of superhuman good by just being able to calculate the perplexities directly.
That's really interesting. So like just to kind of play back what you just said is um rather than like prompt the model and be like, I'm going to run this experiment, what do you think? What you do is you like write a future neuroscience paper and then you run that through the model and calculate its perplexity.
Yeah, I mean, you got the total idea. What we do is like so much simpler. Like we have these two abstracts, like sort of the original version and the altered, with the one with the altered result. And we just get a number for each one, like the perplexity. How surprising is the original one? How surprising is the altered one? And the model just chooses whichever one's lower. But you could do what you were doing. Like this is what I kind of see I think you're like already seeing where this is going, because I think for scientific discovery, to me, this is the first step. You have to be able to predict, like, did this experiment go this way or that way? And if you did that, you could start doing more interesting things like you're saying, and build tools on top to say, like, what experiment should I run next, and so forth. Or is this plausible? Like, would this work out how I think? And you could even pair that with generation, because you could have the model in prompt mode generate different patterns of results. Then you could use it to actually to evaluate through perplexity which one is most likely, to be reasonable.
That's really interesting. Yeah, this is just this sort of like I think an interesting dovetail and like into like how might science change with this kind of with these kinds of tools. And for people who have been listening to this podcast, I've gotten on my soapbox like once or twice before about what I think, and I'm sort of curious to like to like explain it a little bit to you and then kind of like get your take, as because I'm just like some guy with a newsletter and a podcast.
No, no, I think in
Um,
this day and age, like people that are placed like you are actually the ones that are really important, because you're integrating all these kind of siloed perspectives and linking things together. Like I think it's really valuable. And I mean, you're being humble, but you should give yourself more credit. So I want to hear what you have to say.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I appreciate that. Well, I guess like the place I usually start is science seems to have been like really obsessed with explanations for a really long time, like basically since science was invented, which makes a lot of sense because explanations are extremely powerful for making predictions, and they're also like kind of beautiful to understand how the world works. And it has like finding scientific explanations has worked like really well in lots of areas of science, like physics or like chemistry, stuff like that. But there are lots of areas of science like psychology, and the quote unquote soft sciences where like actual causal, um, parsimonious scientific explanations are like really 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 hard to find. And that's what makes studies hard to replicate and all that kind of stuff. And if you look at the history of psychology, we've been trying to figure out what depression is or anxiety is or whatever for like 150 years, and like we have some different lenses on what it is, but like there's no we don't have like the germ theory of mental illness, for example. Like we just don't actually know what it is, and there's lots of different competing ideas. um, but we keep looking for explanations because we feel like that's the only way to make good predictions about what to do. And my kind of contention is that machine learning AI approaches allow us to kind of like unbundle explanations from predictions, so we can get good predictions without having to explain anything, having any good theories about what's underneath. Um, and so we sort of turn this like science problem into an engineering problem, which is like instead of explaining depression, we just predict it. And if you can predict it, one is you can start to help people. So you can predict when it's gonna happen to someone. You can predict what interventions are going to work. And then two, if you've developed a good enough predictor for that kind of phenomena in the world, like theoretically, the theory exists in the neural network somewhere, and neural networks are more interpretable than human brains are in general. And so you may be able to actually like find a good causal theory of depression inside of a neural network, if it's sufficiently predicting, which I think is like really cool. Or what you may find, which I kind of feel like is probably the case, but I'm curious what you think. What you may find is that the theories for higher level phenomena like depression are so big that they don't fit in our rational brains. And so that's why like a good clinician has a good intuitive sense of what's wrong with someone, and can kind of like help them, help them overcome their depression, but like, and they can give some sort of explanation for what's going on, but like really a lot of stuff is just happening subconsciously. And so I think like the larger impact of all of this is like we may start to realize that um, we put too much emphasis on our like rational problem solving logical brains and not enough emphasis on our intuitive brains. And AI may help us like kind of realize the like power of intuition, because AI like makes intuition sort of like usable, in the same way that like logic, you can write down logical arguments. You can also build an AI predictor that has human intuition in it, which I think is like really really cool. And it may also change how we do science. So like instead of doing small scale studies, we will just try to do much larger scale studies where we're like getting lots of data together, and that's like the project of science, and then we build predictors on top of that. So that's a very very long spiel. There's a lot in there, but I'm sort of curious what you think.
No, I mean, I largely agree, and could even see taking what you say further. I mean, certainly, like, I mean, I've been trained as like a cognitive psychologist, and I'm kind of more migrated to machine learning, AI. So, like, a lot of things we do are exactly like you described. So, it's not if you ask a great baseball player how they hit the ball, they'll tell you something, but it's pretty much useless and doesn't describe what they do at all, which is really one probably a reason why a lot of great athletes end up being like terrible coaches and managers. There's not really that strong of a correlation. And um, but yeah, I mean, I might take it further. So I don't think it's a hard versus soft science thing. I think it this really nice coupling of explanation prediction. I fear it might be a historical phenomenon, and it really only applies to some aspects of physics because you could do things that I don't know if I mean not even psychology, you could just in biological sciences, like everything is so messy. It just might be that there's 10,000 variables and they're all interacting, and these variables are at different levels, like we were saying, from DNA to behavior, and there's all these feedback cycles and delays, and that just might be what it's like. And if that's what it's like, that's just not going to have a clean explanation that will be human understandable. And so at that point, it almost becomes like storytelling to have an explanation. And the explanation and the prediction, much like hitting the baseball, or it's going to diverge more and more with time. Unfortunately, again, this is not how I want the world to be, because I was always somebody that would try to come up with the crisp explanation. Even when I do modeling, I don't want to just say the model worked. I want to understand the principles behind it and how they interacted to give rise to the behavior of the model. Have understanding, intuitive sense of understanding, and a solid scientific explanation. But I don't know if that's our future. I use this joke sort of like, I mean, imagine like explaining quantum mechanics to a dog. It's like quantum mechanics is a very well specified theory, but it's just beyond a dog. And like, maybe at some point we're the dogs, like we're not going to understand what's going on. And we build tools we can already see beyond our eyes with telescopes, and we could add up numbers we can't add, with calculators and before computers, do all these amazing things. So maybe like it's just going to be beyond us. And we'll have to accept it and take different forms of explanation that are much more general and much more about like, well, we built the system and we put these constraints on, or for like taking it back to BrainGPT, it could be like, it's like it might be really general stuff like is psychology and neuroscience related fields? Does knowing about behavior help prediction about neuroscience? Well, I don't know. Let's train a model that has both psychology and neuroscience in it. Does it predict neuroscience better? Okay, then those fields are related. That's a kind of explanation, but it's not like, like E equals MC squared or something. It's not very clean. Or so maybe we're going to have stuff like that in the future as explanation, and or maybe we're just going to be in this predictive world and it's not even dystopian, like everything could be better, but like we'll just have stories about how this stuff works. So like maybe scientists will be like the new priests, just interpreting things and like making it, explaining it to how it works and providing meaning to the systems. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we're quite there yet, and many of my colleagues would disagree, but I could see a world in which like science, explanation and prediction unfortunately diverge. And it's not because anybody did something wrong. It's just because the world's really complex. Systems are complex, and we're not just, our brains aren't built to make sense of this kind of stuff.
What do you think is the like if one of your colleagues that would disagree, like what would be like a reasonable counter to this like this viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah, it's like maybe I'm so on this train, I have trouble simulating it. But I think a lot of things would just be, appeal to the past and really elegant theories that unlocked understanding and explanation. And I mean, I'm I'm I could even point to things I've done myself that have that flavor. But a lot of the arguments that I come across are not really forward looking. They're more like in the past it was this way, but in the past we didn't have. I mean, we're having increasingly more large data sets available, and there's more and more different types of data to link together, not just in the commercial world, but in the scientific world, like massive DNA databases and disease databases and brain recordings from the same people. And the scientific literature just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it just seems like, it's sort of like a sensor fusion problem at some point of connecting these dots. So again, I don't think that was like what it was like in the past. But I mean, I guess first, yeah, so I think also scientists tend to like look up to physics too much, and it hasn't worked that way there. And not being an expert in physics, I'd be surprised if many parts of physics aren't already like what I'm saying, because it's probably at some point things are going to get many variables complicated there. So that not everybody's trying to do the grand unified theory. Most people are like, I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing if something sort of veers into the real world, like trying to build a containment field for fusion or something, I bet there's tons of machine learning going on there. And again, I know nothing about that. It just seems like the kind of thing where it's going to get complicated. There's going to be many variables to balance and time series, and it's not going to come down to like some simple equation with a square in it or something. Yeah.
That yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess like what I'm sort of pondering right now is like I obviously like feel like there's like we're sort of approaching the world where like maybe we don't jettison explanations entirely, but like our emphasis shifts a bit, particularly in science, from like like clean explanations to like the stuff we're talking about, like predictions and stuff like that, and using different models to like draw different conclusions, which means we're not necessarily always getting down to the brass tacks of like we know how every causal interaction happens, but like we can generally know what is going to happen, or all that kind of stuff. Um, but I guess one of the things that your dog analogy reminded me of is just like how do we make a world where that is true that's also not a huge bummer?
Yeah.
Like what
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of interesting things about it, but like it also I can imagine like thinking towards a world like that and being like, oh, I guess we're like just fundamentally limited. Like that sucks. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I don't. I'm more positive. I mean, I think for people. I mean, first for most people, and like not denigrating most people, if they're healthier, the economy grows, the climate doesn't collapse, and so forth, they're probably going to be pretty happy with the future. If we have a future where we could predict, disease and how to, you know, have sustainable energy, everything, if if these predictive tools unlock those kind of discoveries, most people be happier. But people, I guess you and me, like we want to actually have some insight into what's going on. And I guess there it's just going to maybe be different forms of explanation. I remember as an undergraduate, when neural networks were really out of style, and learning about them and having fun, programming up from scratch and see my own little backprop nets and stuff like that, and didn't really understand what was going on in the weights, but I almost felt there was a different kind of understanding or something deeper by this kind of system could do this problem. So there might be that kind of explanation, exactly like what you're saying, where you can't like trace it all out. You might even be able to do what the Judea Pearl type people that really emphasize interventions in systems, like tweaking, I don't know, like zapping this neuron or changing something or doing an intervention and who knows in our climate, and then being able to predict how that cascades forward. I mean, longest, I don't know, maybe the kind of explanations will be the kinds of variables that are involved, some gross characterization of the system and the dynamics, and it'll be just like you're saying, not charting out the whole causal network, because that just might not really be something that's possible, and it's probably not even what the machine learning systems are doing. So I don't even know if we could distill it like yeah. So yeah, I just think maybe what we accept as an explanation could change over time too. I mean, people change, and our expectations of, I mean, how we understand the world must be so different now than 500 years ago. What we would find satisfying. So maybe it's just going to change again, and we're worrying about something that people in 100 years from now just won't even think twice about.
Yeah. I kind of think that that's true. Like I do, like you mentioned the idea of like, okay, how do we tell if two fields are related? Well, we run it through a model, and if it says it's related, then it is. And that's like, maybe that's not satisfying to us today, but it will be satisfying to like a future generation of scientists. And I think the conditions under which that would be satisfying is like, we have a model that is like so standardized and like well used that everyone has an intuition for like what it is and trusts it to some degree. And in that case, like getting new results from that model, I think will be like fascinating and really interesting in the same way as like finding some like underlying causal network or something like that. Like it's pretty clear we're moving to a world where using models to judge things is like a really important way to make progress in science, but also just like in AI in general. Like we're kind of like reaching that point too, where in like mechanistic interpretability, like it's so complicated that you have to use models to like find features of models and all that kind of stuff. And I just think that that feels like a place that's pretty we're moving towards.
Yeah, yeah, it could be. I mean, obviously, there's tons of really smart people working on interpretable AI, both building it in from the start, but also kind of in a post examination of these models. So even if we're moving towards that world, maybe along the way that will help us transition, or maybe there'll be a breakthrough. But I'm just skeptical because if the underlying reality is so complicated and we have a model that appreciates that underlying reality, then the explanation might basically be the weights of the model in the training set. And so at that point, I don't know what you do, but maybe we'll have some, purchase, some transition, and obviously that work's important. And when we make these models, we're never going to blindly trust them. So we're going to need all kinds of checks along the way, and mitigate bias and so forth. But yeah, I think we're going to that world just because that's the world that things are going to get done in. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious, like you referenced, I don't know, like a couple minutes ago, like one of the reasons this is so hard is maybe the way reality works is it's like 10,000 variables weekly interacting, and that's really hard to create a prediction around, or sorry, an explanation around. Can you explain what that, like why that is, like what that means, where you see that? Like I'm assuming you're talking about, for example, like genomics or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything, or like why we're doing what we're doing right now in this conversation, it's just everything is that way. I mean, even in physics, I mean, you think of like everything's like this idealized spherical, particle in some vacuum or something, and none of that stuff would even work in the real world when you have more variables like the wind resistance, the friction, this, and um, the material stressing, and but. Yeah, so I just Yeah, sorry, could you maybe I think I got lost too many variables. Could you even like repeat the question? I mean, I just think everything is has this flavor to it, when it gets closer to the real world. But yeah, so I mean, a lot of the issue too is like anything biological, it's probably beyond biology. So like, even in social sciences and economics, you have all these interacting elements and like in an economy, and that's just incredibly complicated. But in biology, of course, you have the cell itself is really complicated. Then you have all these interactions there and history. And you mentioned DNA and how things, how proteins are expressed, but also then what you could think of it also. I mean, I think I'm like a physicalist from a philosophy standpoint, so I think things, even if you have to study higher level things like psychology, neuroscience, and ultimately there is like this lower level explanation. It's just, again, too many variables. Humans can't make sense of it. But you could think of like all our goals and what we do as also affects what goes on in our brain and like how things wire up. So there's just so many interactions across the levels. And if you think of what engineers do, they do go to great pains to reduce those interactions. But evolution, physical reality doesn't care about this stuff. But when an engineer makes abstraction layers, you have the machine code and then maybe the assembly and then something like C or Fortran, and then you have Python libraries on top. And I'm not doing a good job describing this. And you have application, and then like younger people today, a lot of them don't even know there's a file system on the computer, what a folder is, because it's like so abstracted. I mean, which I guess is great, but it's sort of like no one knows how to change the oil in their car or anything because we've abstracted away. But we build the things like that, and there's a lot of effort that goes into that. But I don't think nature or biology respects that. So it just makes it kind of a mess to unravel. And of course, even with our systems, we have bugs and weird things happen. Like I remember decades ago, the Intel chip, screwing up arithmetic or something from some hardware bug, and it's just like really hard because it's spilled into other layers, in the abstraction hierarchy.
Yeah, and I think you've thought a lot about like um, the ways that trying to make natural interactions or natural processes human understandable like actually might cause us to misinterpret them. You have one paper in particular called "The Inevitability and Superfluousness of Cell Types in Spatial Cognition." Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Like, introduce what the paper is, what the motivation behind it is, and what the results is that you found.
Yeah, yeah, it's really like a lot of our conversation is kind of leaning to this idea. So, for most of neuroscience, a lot of the major discoveries, including multiple Nobel Prizes, have been somebody recording from a cell, either in an human or a non-human animal, and basically having some intuition, some clear explanation. Like, for example, there's these things in the brain called place cells, and they light up when a rodent's at a particular location, and it's in its box. They're like, aha, this is like the brain's GPS system. And that's very intuitive and appealing, but it's very also like simplistic because the situation the animal is very like contrived, and we're kind of forcing this interpretation. And so what we found in this paper is many of these intuitive cell types that you could just interpret them, and it seems like, oh, the brain's so simple. It has, when you do this, this fires, and when you do this, this fires, and you could make sense of this in a very human understandable way. What we found is that when you take larger networks like deep networks and you put them in VR worlds, a lot like the experiments neuroscientists run on non-human animals, that you get these same cell types popping up even in random networks that don't serve the function of navigation or localization like the place cells. So it's really like kind of a danger, I think, of trying to force the intuitive understanding on the system. um, it's just like you'll find it, but it's not actually how the system works. And even within the field where people believe in these kind of easy to label intuitive cell types, what happens is there's this general pattern where someone will say, Eureka, I found the place cell, and they'll literally get a Nobel Prize. And then there'll be 30 years of research explaining how it's not really a place cell. Like, oh, well, if the room isn't perfectly round, then you get like this distortion. Oh, if there's a reward like food, then it doesn't code for that. Oh, it depends on the history of the path. Oh, it depends on the viewpoint somewhat. And so it's like maybe we'd actually understand what was going on more if we would do kind of more of I don't know, respect the complexity of the system we're dealing with. In some ways, do something a little bit more bottom up, still having mechanistic explanations and models. But I mean, this stuff is just like so complicated and it seems just ridiculous. It's almost like again, and this is going to get me in like trouble with people. And I think people like hate this paper, even though it will be published and have impact. It's almost like our kids' view of science, like, oh, I just mix some chemicals and something happened, and I tell people about it, and it's a discovery. Or oh, look, I found this butterfly. No one found this before. That's so important. But that's not really like what scientific explanations are like. And it's just when you're dealing with a system as complex as the brain and people and so multi-level, it just seems so vanishingly unlikely that whatever idea you go in with is what you're going to come out is going to be actually true, or there's no, unless there's some reason for like information to be coded that way. It just, so I think this is a problem because those are the explanations people find attractive, but I think they're very seductive but ultimately limiting.
That's really interesting. Why do you think, like, given that we like those kinds of explanations, what would you guess is the reason? Like, we're just attracted to kind of those like sort of parsimonious, like that's the way our brains work. What is it about those kinds of explanations? If they must work for something, right?
Yeah. I mean, again, like this is where I'm glad I have some training as a cognitive psychologist, but everything I'm going to say is going to be so obvious. I mean, it's just like if you're a politician running for office, simple story, coherent narrative works best. It's like what's going to have the best information transmission value. It's going to be most viral. If you're what does a lawyer do in a jury trial? They create a narrative where their client is like innocent. That's a coherent story. So I think people really prize this kind of coherency. It's just like what makes an appealing explanation to us. But again, some things, even things that are actually pretty simple, like in terms of just writing out what it is, like quantum mechanics, that makes no sense intuitively, and that's pretty simple. But then I think when you get into things like, again, anything involving the real world or biology, it's just going to be so many variables. You could tell the clear intuitive story, but I'm not even sure in cases it'll be an approximation of the real thing, or it'll be like so crude and off it'll obscure or miss like deeper truths. But yeah, I just think, I mean, we like that. I mean, in some sense it's good. It's almost like Occam's razor for some things. You don't want needlessly complicated explanations, but and sometimes you need it. Sometimes you need the more complex model to, fit the data, make the prediction, characterize the system. And I don't think humans just go in by default thinking things are that complicated. And we didn't really like, I mean, I don't want to try to guess how we evolved, but like, we didn't really live in a world where things had to be that, like they weren't like the quantum world, the 10,000 variables of how the brain works, big data world. So probably having simple, robust procedures serves us well in our natural environments, but maybe doesn't serve us well in science.
Yeah, I guess that's maybe what I'm thinking right now is like, um, the brain has like really high dimensional representations of things in the world that are very complicated and would be very hard to like have a scientific explanation for. And like our natural inclination towards like sort of simple causal stories that we can tell, maybe like the proper place for those kinds of things are to like slightly tweak our much higher dimensional like concept for a particular context, and like we're kind of like misusing that to try to like um blow it up into like it representing the entire high dimensional representation that like really we can't put into language. And like we've been sort of trained that the more parsimonious and powerful those little things are, the better they are. But like that sort of gets misused when it goes beyond what they're capable of representing.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it gets even trickier because, of course, that we're not passive recipients of data in science. We go out and collect it. So once you start believing something, a story, you just basically there's a lot of confirmatory work in science. So you'll just basically, and if you have that mindset about what the relevant variables are, even if you don't think you're being confirmatory, you kind of are confirming the framework. So I think it's what you're saying, but we even do things to keep those simple stories going probably longer than they should.
Yeah. I guess like if you could, this is a big question, so like, take a second to think through it, but like
Uh-oh.
if like if you could sort of like wave a magic wand and like all the priors of science were thrown out for a second and you could like rebuild science as an institution, like knowing what we know today about how hard this stuff is, like what are the things you would change and like how would you rebuild science for this world?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, so I think it's really good that nobody has that much power because probably what I say is wrong, but probably what other people say is wrong too. Personally, I would do a combination of training people like this conversation to be a little bit more philosophical about things and maybe do some reading and thinking there about what explanations are and the limits and the study of it, but also like more emphasis to which is already happening on computational skills, large scale simulations, and the field's going this way too, but more consideration of naturalistic environments and their complexity and how there should be like whole like courses in science for university students about how limiting the problem that might work well in like a particle accelerator in physics if you're working with the standard model, but probably everything else you're going to miss key variables and insights. I mean, especially anything involving human behavior or biological system. So I guess really just kind of a different orientation for scientists, have them be a little bit more thoughtful and philosophical about the whole enterprise. And just like everything's going to be AI, computational, large data sets. Even if there's a beautiful experiment that can isolate something for a key question that you can't resolve with these large data sets. So something that when I did some work with consumer behavior to look at human decision making in the real world, like in retail settings, and it was like doing these big studies with like millions of people transactions, but then we'd bring it back into the lab and try to test something. So I think emphasizing that interplay, I think if you're going to run lab studies, I think there has to be the interplay with something more naturalistic, real world, big data, just so you don't just make up like kind of like a fake science of itself, because you could have a science of anything and it might just not have anything to do with anything anyone really cares about ultimately, like in 100 years.
Yeah. Who do
Yeah.
you think's doing like good work on like in on this along this vein, like in your field or in other fields that you know about?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so I mean, a lot of people are doing amazing work, and I'm very like self-critical and critical of other people, but luckily I don't share it with them. So I probably won't be great at like naming a bunch of people. But I mean, one maybe to use one whole subfield is I mean, years ago when I was in graduate school, like the computer vision. They're mostly guys, but they were like the big jocks of the field. Like, oh, they had the most mathematic chops, and they were doing the real science with all the filters and Fourier transforms and really leading the way. And then along comes AlexNet, like this convolutional network, not made by vision scientists, but by machine learning AI researchers. And overnight, that in terms of behavior, that was the best model of object recognition. So what happened is neuroscientists, computational neuroscientists, took that on as a model for the ventral visual stream. So how our brain transforms our vision images on our eye into like that's a chair, that's a cat. And they found that it's not a clean, that perfectly clean story like they present. And I have actually a paper criticizing the basic story, but I think it was a real advance to show that the levels of processing in these models, these artificial neural networks, fairly well track the transformations that went in our own brains. And so this is an example where going larger, naturalistic, training this model on 1 million natural images, basically taking the whole problem on at once and doing something at scale led to a bigger advance than like 100 years of vision science and all these grants for this. And it was done by neuroscientists, but it was really kicked off by engineering and embracing this real world challenge. And I think that should be really humbling to scientists. And so I don't want to single out anybody, but there's a number of people that did that. And scientists are very almost like faddish. Like if one person has a good idea, they all kind of rush to the same thing. So there's been a lot of really smart people that have jumped on that train. And now it's like sort of petering out and it's like the next generation questions are happening. But yeah, so that's an example that kind of goes with what we're discussing.
That makes sense. And then in terms of like, wanting scientists to be a little bit more thoughtful and philosophical about like what the methods of science are, do you have any like um people or writers or, philosophical ideas that you think are like like they should be reading or we should be reading, even if it's not like for lay people, just like in general, like what who are the philosophical people that get you excited?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, so I'd say this book that I read recently, it's an older book by Thomas Nagel, who's a philosopher of science that recently passed away. It's called, so he's famous, this is not what I'm recommending, it's a good essay, but he's famous for What's It Like Being a Bad essay, where it's just sort of about subjective experience and how you couldn't really know what it's like to be a bad because you'd have to be a bad, and then when you go back to being a person, when, but he wrote this book, The View from Nowhere, that even though he's an incredibly famous philosopher, I feel like it should have way more impact because the first half, I think, really explains what science is and what it's not. And I think a lot of scientists, people that seem like they're being more inclusive in some way of topics, like this could probably apply to consciousness research. Um, in some ways they're doing scientism in an overstep. So the reason the book's called The View from Nowhere is because that's what science is. So there isn't science for you or me, or there isn't like Eastern science or Western science. It's like, from this disembodied perspective, and that's has both strengths and weaknesses. So if you launch a probe to Mars and put it in order, like Mars doesn't care who came up with the calculations. It's either going to make it or not make it. And so that's kind of the view from nowhere. But of course, a lot of human experience that's very valuable is subjective, and that's like kind of where meaning comes in our lives. And so what I liked about that book is making clear like what the strengths of science are, but in some ways he doesn't like hit this over the head with it. But for me, what I really got away was the limits of science. So I really liked that book.
That's really cool. I love that. How do you think that relates to, I mean, you're an experimental psychologist. So like, how does that relate to like the field of psychology, which obviously is like, it's trying to be science, but then there's also like, it's also all about human experience.
Yeah. So like again, I mean, another person would be good to read would be like late Wittgenstein. So I'm not trying to be like some kind of logical positives that you could only rely on the observables and whatnot. But I think there is like some overstep. So a lot of times, so psychology, like in terms of like experimental psychology, um, most people I would say are scientists and are doing science, but like there is like sort of this overstep at times because you're really limited to what you could. I mean, it's just like you tell an undergraduate what you could operationalize. So like what's depression? Well, you have to like come up with some criteria for it. Or like what's this? Or I mean, even we do it even when you're doing neural recording. As soon as you count something, you're saying that you're abstracting in a sense. You're saying there's some way in which these are alike, and you're ignoring other ways in which they're um, different. So like that's kind of like the standard. I mean, that's sort of again like the view from nowhere, trying to like make a procedure where you could just observe things and quantify them away, where you could start testing out hypotheses. But a lot of times, I think psychologists and people in general get neuroscientists, others get confused that they could have like some deep insights into our subjective experiences, or like what people call like the quali of, why does the blue make me feel this way? And when you start getting into that, like you could come up with like, very good things. Like if I put you under this anesthesia, will you wake up or not? Under what conditions? What brain waves can you measure that will predict that or account for that, or even some mechanisms? But I think a lot of these, like when it gets too into not the view from nowhere, but like kind of the view from inside, this first person perspective, which is mostly what we care about, is like creatures. Like I mean, I actually don't think science in general has a lot to say beyond correlates of these experiences. And that's probably why we still have literature and religion and music and all these arts and all these other things. Yeah.
I definitely like, I mean, I feel like literature as an exploration of psychology is like quite undervalued by people who are into science. Like I think some people think about literature and psychology as being very intertwined, but like um as not a professional psychologist myself, but one who has like read a lot of psychology books and also has read a lot of novels.
Yeah.
Like there's something about that, or like even the like literary tradition in psychoanalysis, where it's like a lot of the earlier work is like less about like, okay, you have these cognitive distortions and like we're going to do a worksheet or whatever, but it's like really really long kind of like literary storytelling about particular patients and stuff that I honestly think is like underutilized.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you were saying before about like the intuition and the many variables. So it could be like even as a, I mean, a lot of, yeah, I mean, so I don't know much about clinical work and like less about things that are considered, outside science, like Freudian analysis. But I could imagine someone doing a lot of good work within that framework, because even if the theory doesn't hold any water as a scientific theory, it could still be the intuition someone builds up working within that system are very valuable and can create good outcomes for people. And yeah, so like I don't put my faith or my life in the hands of like alternative practitioners, but when people get outcomes or anything like this, I try to be a little bit slow to completely um, dismiss it, and not at least of which, because like placebo effects while under attack are probably real in cases, but I mean there's practices that might be done that could, I mean, sort of like cultural knowledge. I mean, like Italians know how to make good food and things like this. It's just, and it's from like hundreds of years of tweaking things and trying things out. So that's even beyond the individual. And so maybe some of the training these folks receive in clinical settings. I mean, some things, like cognitive behavioral therapy and has some like random control trial backing, but yeah. Anyway.
I'm not trying to, yeah, to be clear, I'm not trying to like totally diss it. I just like
No,
there's,
no.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Please, totally
yeah.
just you're not upsetting me. And I think after just basically made fun of a few Nobel prizes in neuroscience, I've got no one's gonna like me anyway, so I'll just lean into it.
Great. Well, we'll
Yeah,
be in the same boat then.
yeah,
Cool. Well, this is a really truly fascinating discussion. I'm really thankful that we got a chance to chat. If people are interested in learning more about your research, like where can they find you and what should they read?
yeah. Sure. They could go to my website, which is bradlove.org. There's also a link to the BrainGPT website. And if people are interested in that project, we have a mailing list, and we don't spam people. We probably only send a few messages a year with major updates. So if people want to follow that project, they could sign up there. And most of, I mean, they should. I'll put a link up to this podcast when it's out. So, and others. So if they want to see more like popular media stuff, that's on the website as well. And if anyone's really a glutton for punishment, of course, they could just start reading abstracts and papers. But I'm not sure I could recommend that to the casual listener.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Bradley. I really appreciate this. Whenever you have more stuff to share, I would love to have you back.
No, that'd be great. Yeah, thanks so much, Dan, for having me here. It was a blast.
Oh my gosh, folks, you absolutely positively have to smash that like button and subscribe to AI and I. Why? Because this show is the epitome of awesomeness. It's like finding a treasure chest in your backyard, but instead of gold, it's filled with pure, unadulterated knowledge bombs about ChatGPT. Every episode is a roller coaster of emotions, insights, and laughter that will leave you on the edge of your seat, craving for more. It's not just a show, it's a journey into the future with Dan Shipper as the captain of the spaceship. So do yourself a favor, hit like, smash subscribe, and strap in for the ride of your life. And now, without any further ado, let me just say, Dan, I'm absolutely hopelessly in love with you.